So I'm going to give a quick introduction here. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Louise Walker and I'm the Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement Coordinator for the Mutographs project, and I help to support Maggie and Mimi to do their involvement work. So first of all, I just wanted to start off by talking about what PPIE actually is. So if you hear a reference to PPIE, what that stands for is Patient and Public Involvement and Engagement. And that can cover a range of different things. So public engagement can cover things like going out into communities, going out into schools, raising awareness of the work we do, raising awareness of the Mutographs project, having a dialogue with those communities and getting insights from them, and potentially inspiring the next generation of scientists and things like that. But also what we need to make sure we're doing is we need to make sure we're engaging with the right people that we need to talk to in order to make sure that the results of the Mutographs are reaching the right people. So this means we need to make sure we're engaging with policymakers, with healthcare professionals, with people like that throughout all the different sites where the Mutographs is taking place. As far as patient involvement goes, that's a little bit more of a higher level of engagement. So what that is it's taking the voices of people that have experience of the condition, so people that have experience of cancer, either through living with it themselves or from having family experience, and making sure that their voices are heard throughout the project. And in ways that patient involvement can help with projects is to look at study protocols to make sure they're acceptable, to make sure that the use of tissue or the use of data is acceptable to patients. It can help with ethics applications as well, because there's an increasing amount of requests from ethics bodies to have patients review protocols to make sure they're acceptable, and look at grant applications as well to make sure that the patient voice is being heard throughout the project. So one of the things that I like to think about when we're talking about patient and public involvement is to remember the mantra, nothing about us without us. So people affected by cancer, so patients and their families are run through the entirety of the Mutographs project. At the very start of the project, it's them that are donating the samples. They run throughout the project. The patients are there when you're looking at the samples, when you're analysing their DNA. That's all still the patients. And they're the people at the very end of the project as well. They're the people that we need to be speaking with. They're the people that are going to most benefit from the results. And they're the people that are at high risk of cancer, are those that we need to be engaging with in order to convey the results of the Mutographs project so they have a potential for prevention. So hopefully a lot of you have been speaking to Maggie and Mimi throughout this conference and in previous meetings, but I'm just going to allow them to introduce themselves and give you a little bit of background for those who haven't met them yet. Maggie?
Yes, I'm the one on the left up there. I'm Maggie Blanks. I got involved in the cancer world, I guess, after my late husband Alan died of pancreatic cancer in 2003. And pancreatic cancer was something I'd sort of vaguely heard of, but didn't know a great deal about, like I think many, certainly in the UK. It was learning shortly after his death just how little research funding was going into pancreatic cancer that I decided I needed to do something to help increase some funding, raise some new money for more research. And so I set up a charity snappily called Pancreatic Cancer Research Fund. And that's, I think, partly the reason I am involved in the Mutographs project.
I'm Mimi McCord. I have not a dissimilar story to Maggie. My husband died from esophageal adenocarcinoma in 2002 at the age of 47, 9 weeks after diagnosis. His death was completely and utterly preventable had we known of the link between heartburn, Barrett's esophagus, and esophageal adenocarcinoma. So as far as I was concerned, a complete negative and something that was so preventable had to be turned into a positive. And Heartburn Cancer UK is, I suppose, my coping mechanism. We raise awareness, we educate the general public and the medical profession, because I think GPs are woefully uneducated in signs, symptoms and progression onto specialist services. So that is basically me on a mission.
So a really important part of the patient involvement work for the Mutographs project is to go out into the field, and so we can understand the context of the various places that we're getting samples from, because there's obviously lots of different cultural, societal, religious impacts that affect people's response to cancer, how they feel about cancer, and then we need to understand those contexts in order to make sure that we're communicating with the right people in the right way. So far, Maggie and Mimi have been on 2 field trips, and so the first one is to Kenya. So if you want to, going to let them share their reflections a little bit now. So Mimi, do you want to start?
The first thing that was very, very apparent was the cancer stigma. And this was very much reflected in the late stage of diagnosis of squamous cell carcinoma. They would go to the witch doctor, the health, the herbalist and the faith healer. They knew and they were aware of the symptoms because it is very common in Kenya. So it was when they eventually had such difficulty in swallowing, they would embark on a long journey, an arduous journey to hospital. And I mean, they would be going sort of 80 to 100, 160 kilometers with a relative to get to, for example, the Moi Teaching Hospital in Eldoret. And they would arrive in the most emaciated state. You can see the endoscopy suite. They would be brought into the suite by the relative or friend. And sedation didn't happen. We saw 2 procedures. One was an endoscopy, and the other was stenting. And watching these patients undergoing a procedure that was so uncomfortable was very, very difficult to watch. But the patient that was being stented, the tumour was 14 centimetres. It was the largest tumour that they had seen. And the surgeons or the endoscopists that were there were visiting from Boston, and the lead worked for 10 months in Boston and would then work for free at the hospital, bringing with him the stenting. So that made a big impact on me. But going to traditional healers, etc., is actually something that is common and a philosophy that's held within the medical profession. You know, they're highly educated people, but they still have this deep-seated belief in faith healing, etc. You will see rural homes. These we visited, and it was almost like being transported into a film set. The cooking fires start at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and they go on until late at night. And they burn corn cobs which have a fungicide on them. So, you know, what is this doing to both the women using the fires to cook and children, etc.? I lasted 15 seconds in a smoky environment, and these women and children are there all day into the evening. So that made a big impact. Sorry.
I suppose my reflections on Kenya were the impact of what Mimi referred to, the stigma of cancer, because this PPI activity encouraged very much by the Cancer Research UK process. I was aware of that, obviously, in terms of how it works in the UK. Being involved in the Mutographs project, we're talking about a global project, research going on in 5 continents. And so the questions to be mindful about, as far as I was concerned, were, okay, I have my UK experience, and I can guess at some of the things that we might find in other countries. But I need to think about what are the questions to go on these field trips with. And so, for me, an important one is, how is cancer perceived here? And so Kenya was a very interesting place to go to for our first field trip, because as you've heard Mimi say, the answer was, well, with great secrecy, a perspective of stigma. And so with that attitude amongst the population that we were going to be visiting particularly, that raises questions then of how do the results that we hope will come out of the Mutographs project in relation to esophageal in East Kenya particularly, how do those results, those messages get conveyed? So the other thing that became clear very quickly, for me anyway, was the importance of not only understanding the patient perspective, but also understanding what other mechanisms, channels do we need to look for in the places we're going to that can be the aiders of getting the messages across in the future, whether that's mechanisms of communication like mobile phones, radio, etc., but also who are the key people who can be listened to by the folk in the region that we're in at any particular time.
Okay, and now for something completely different, because the second field trip was to the Czech Republic. So Maggie, do you want to start this one?
Yes, the Czech Republic was our second and more recent trip, and as you might expect, we did find a different context. For me, the answer to my question, how is cancer perceived here, was very different from the answer I was getting in Kenya. It's very much more like what I'd come to experience in the UK. There was awareness of it. And I perhaps, in terms of the reasons that we were in the Czech Republic, examples of high incidence of colorectal cancer, kidney, pancreas, there's a colorectal screening program, which they're proud of and gets a reasonable take-up. I think I came away with the feeling that maybe the population awareness of pancreas cancer and its incidence in the Czech Republic was not perhaps so well established. But what impressed me, and again is I think going to be an important vehicle for future dissemination of Mutograph results, was this fairly recent but great enthusiasm at the health ministry level to recognise patient groups, patient representation, and build that into their future health planning and research activities and so on.
What surprised me was the freedom of choice that the general public had within the Czech Republic. They do not have to use GPs as the gatekeeper to the next stage. They can do a self-referral, so it's almost a self-diagnosis into self-referral to the specialist that they think is suits their requirements, which yes, gives them freedom of choice, but can delay a diagnosis. So, you know, for example, pancreatic cancer has a lot of vague symptoms. If they think it is something completely different, then there is a delay in having a diagnosis, which with pancreatic cancer can be a question of life or death. So that I looked at with interest. And I wondered whether it was freedom of choice, but I'll leave that one with you. And also in the Czech Republic, health insurance is mandatory. So everybody has health insurance, and I think there are about 7 different health insurance companies, and GPs have their particular favourites, not necessarily all 7 of them. And those that are unemployed or homeless or whatever, then the state pay for them. And companies will use a sort of incentive scheme to encourage their employees to go for regular health checks, which I think is a brilliant idea. Something that perhaps might suit the UK. And the other, my sort of final thought was within the Ministry of Health, the patients and predominantly patients have a voice. They are within committees that actually sort of, I think, make legislation, ensure that their voice is heard, which I definitely think is something that the UK should emulate.
Excellent, thank you very much. So as you can see, there's 2 very, very different experiences, but much to learn from both of the field trips we've been on so far. We are currently planning on the next field trip, and we're trying to work out where we want to go. So if anyone wants to pitch for it, come talk to us. So what's next for PPIE and the Mutographs project? So what we want to make sure is that we're making best use of these field trips and the expertise of Maggie and Mimi to make sure that we can maximise the impact of Mutographs. So it's an incredibly complex project. There's a lot of sort of moving parts, but how can we use the experience we have? How can we use the connections we have with patients to make sure that we're reaching the right people? And reaching out to the right communities, especially the ones that are most going to benefit from the final results of Mutographs, should we be successful. So one of the things that we need to think about is how can we reach out to patients and families and people at risk in all of the areas involved in the project. So obviously we've been to Kenya and we've been to the Czech Republic, and we've got one more field trip coming up, but there's obviously lots and lots more centres that have patients that we could be talking to. So how do we work out how to connect with those patients? How can we make sure we connect with the healthcare professionals, the policymakers in the areas where we can't go to the field trips? Because it's important for us to get as much insight as we can as possible into all the different areas, because we need to make sure that we're reaching people. And so that's one of the final questions, is how can we make sure we're communicating with the right people in the right way? As we've discovered from the 2 very different field trips we've had already, we have to think about things like stigma. There's things like religious and cultural sensitivities that we need to be aware of, and we have to take those into account when it comes to doing things like disseminating the results of Mutographs, or talking to people about the Mutographs study, or asking people to donate tissue. And so we need to make sure that we're using this expertise, we're using this experience to make sure that we're getting what we need from the Mutographs project, and that the patients and their families are also getting what they need from us. And another thing to think about is how can we use PPIE techniques to improve future projects. So there will be other similar projects that I'm sure a lot of you are running. And we have the expertise here, we have Maggie and Mimi, and there's lots of things they can do to help you to improve future projects, including things like ethics applications and reviewing things like that. So please do bear that in mind if you're thinking about planning similar things in the future. That it's a really, really good thing to start off your projects, to start off what you're thinking about doing with the patient voice in mind. So if anybody has any thoughts, ideas or comments from this presentation, from patient and public involvement and engagement, please do get in touch. So my email address is on there. Or come and find me and I can give you a card, or talk to one of the Mutographs team here, the IARC team, and they can give you my details. I'm also on Twitter if you're that way inclined, so I'm at Think Scientific. And we'd particularly like to hear from you if you are part of one of the coordinating centres for any of the places that are collecting samples for Mutographs. So if you're from anywhere that you're collecting samples or have collected samples in any of the regions, we'd really, really, really love to hear from you. So please do get in touch. Is that any final reflections? No. Yeah. Okay, so that's all from us. Has anyone got any questions? Nice and comprehensive. Thank you very much.